Let's start with some macroeconomic news then, very much the theme of 2022. We've had some inflation data and some interest rate decisions from both the UK and the US this week. So the general overview goes a bit like this. Inflation in the UK came in at 10.7%, which is actually down from the 11.1 in November. The US was at 7.1%, which is down from 7.7. Interest rates, UK, that was announced today, is up to 3.5%, up from 3%. US up to 4.5% from 4%. Steve, we've been talking about this all year pretty much, so why would we stop now? Any thoughts on any of these?
No, not a great deal, really. It was like the West kept secret in interest rate rises ever. I mean, the inflation news was genuinely positive news. I thought they both came in under expectations, marginally under expectations. That shows that, you know, the trend is at least heading in the right direction. The hikes were what we expected as well. We expected that they would go from 0.75 to 0.5. I think for some reason the market was hoping that this would then lead Jerome Powell to come out and say, all fixed, don't worry about it, this is the last 0.5 and then we're going to go to like no hikes or 0.25 hikes. And he didn't. He sort of came out and committed to the earlier statements, which were generally about he would sooner over tighten than under tighten. And he seems like hell bent on forcing this, like this higher unemployment and what looks like heading to a sort of recessionary economy onto the US, which it could end up being the Great Reset if they over tighten too much, and they could have a lot of people out of work, and they could have very high interest rates, lots of things becoming unaffordable, debt becoming unaffordable, which is a massive problem in the US anyway. But then you look at the sales as well, and you've seen that retail sales are still very strong at the moment, but they're noticing that there's quite a large amount of it going on to not credit cards, because you have to presume they're full. They're now going on to buy now, pay later. So a lot of people are still trying to have this big Christmas in America, and they're doing it on, they were doing it on debt. They usually do it on debt, but now they're doing it on, scary debt. So this could be bad. I don't know. It sounds bad, but the trend, at least for inflation, when inflation comes down to 2 or 3 or whatever Jerome Powell wants to set the new tag as, I do sense that we might be told that so long as inflation is steady, they're happy with that. They might be steady at 3, steady at 3.5, steady at 4. They might adjust the target to that number, because 2 is an arbitrary number. There's never really been a reason why we have 2. I think I was listening to Demoderan the other day, who said it doesn't really matter what inflation is, because the world will react to whatever that number is. It has to be steady. We can't have 2, 6, 12, 20, 2, 6. It has to be one of those. If it's 8 or if it's 6 or if it's 4, it has to be that fairly consistently, and the world will adapt. So interesting to see where we actually head. I don't know how this ends really, but it is nice to see that inflation number coming down, even if in the UK specifically, food prices are still really, really soaring.
Yep, you picked up there right on the end of the thing that was catching my attention. It was the UK inflation number, and that was inflation particularly coming off in things like eating out. So I guess the kind of more discretionary spending stuff. Food prices are still very high. I think they're still moving their way up, actually, for what it's worth, compared to last year. I have this idea in my head that inflation is going to start lapping tough comps at some point, in much the same way as we think about sales growth kind of lapping tough comps for certain companies coming out of COVID and so on. I think something similar is going to be true about inflation. For what it's worth, back to predictions again, I thought that was going to happen this year, and I've been completely wrong about that. But the UK inflation did start coming down, and I wonder whether that's just the start of turning the corner. I'm not going to get particularly carried away with that or very excited about it with inflation at 10.7%. That's a long, long way from 2. It's a long, long way from, I think, any number that could be safely considered kind of home. We've been talking on the show for some time about how, generally speaking, inflation in this kind of situation doesn't come under control until the interest rate crosses the inflation number. And at the moment, you can now see them just starting to work towards each other in the case of the US. So interest rates are up to 3.5%. Inflation is down to 10.7%. I mean, last month it was 11.1, so that was still going up and working its way away from the interest rate number. You can just see that gap starting to close a little bit. It feels to me like the US are an awful long way ahead of us, though, here. They're only a percent higher in interest rates, but the gap between sort of 7.1 and 4 is, okay, there's a 3% spread there. In the UK, it's still close to an 8% spread, or nearly an 8% spread. That feels to me like the US are, well, maybe they're going to hit kind of recession first, but it looks like that's going to be a kind of thing that we see that leading the way, and the UK are following slightly more slowly.
1%'s a lot, though, isn't it, Steve, as well? And I mean, I know US generally have, I seem to remember they generally have higher interest rates than us. I think the lowest they went down to was 0.25%, wasn't it, during COVID, if I remember correctly, whereas we went straight down to zero.
We were at 0.1, I think, yeah.
Yeah, and the Eurozone just gave money away. But 1% is a lot in terms of the debt profile of the two countries. So, and for especially in terms of hikes for Britain, that's two quarters away of hikes essentially, isn't it? So, but one of the positives that did come out of it, Steve, we got an email today from Chase Bank. They had seen the 0.5 hike, and rather than waiting months and months and months, which they did last time, and it got to the point where I moved my emergency fund out, and 3 hours later they said, we're raising the rates higher than where you've moved it. They've actually jumped ahead this time, and they're raising their standard savings account to 2.7%. So obviously Chase, for those who don't know, is a JP Morgan bank. It's won one of our bank awards, I think, when we did those
probably
a while ago. There was a lot of categories, so a lot of things won things. But yeah, we really liked it. I think you beta tested it, Steve, if I remember correctly. And 2.7 is a very attractive rate for savings. What do you think?
Yeah, you're right, I did a user testing thing which turned out to be the JP Morgan Chase app, and I said some things about it which they completely ignored, for what it's worth, in their testing. Presumably no one else thought they were issues, but it wasn't to do with functionality particularly. I was slightly put off by the idea of what appeared to be a Monzo pot-like thing involving setting up new accounts all the time, because going through my head was, why do I need a new account here? This all feels very Wells Fargo to me. Yeah. But they ignored that, and justifiably so. I mean, they are an award-winning bank. Why would they need to listen to the people who, well, distribute the awards, in fairness, but they won anyway. Rising interest rates have got me kind of worried a little bit. I take your point, actually, that the gap between 3.5% to 4.5% is a lot, all right? It's sort of another 30% of the 3.5% thing is kind of the way to think about it, I guess, rather than thinking of it as just the 1% here. The gap between those two is think of one as a proportion of the other one. It's kind of getting me worried a bit for 2023 from an investing perspective. I guess maybe worried, maybe interested, I suppose. A little bit of a spoiler alert for the prediction here, but it does make me think recession is very much kind of on the horizon, and this sort of brings out your thought that there's a big difference between where we started and where we've ended up. We've gone from 0.1 in this country to 3.5, and I think that's going to be a really, really big headwind for growth and going to bring on a recession, and I think it basically has to, because I was just sort of thinking my way through some basic stuff here and thinking, look, companies grow by making investments. They invest in either new outlets if they're a shop, or new products, or whatever they're investing in, but that costs money. So it's only worth them doing it if they're going to get a return on the money they have to send out. So imagine you're a shop like Costco or whatever, and you reckon you can add another $2 million over 30 years by opening a new outlet. Probably more than that if you're a Costco, but take $2 million for the moment. And to do that, you have to borrow $1 million today. And with interest rates at 0.1%, where they were at the start of the year, the cost of that is 1.015 million. It's nearly nothing, more or less. So your $2 million return over 30 years looks pretty good. With interest rates at 4.5%, which is where they are in the US, that's going to cost you 1.8 million, that 2 million return. Is that worth it? Probably not, realistically. It's just going to be the case that store doesn't get opened. And that's going to be the case, I think, as interest rates go up, debt becomes more expensive, cash becomes more valuable, that people are going to have to think, look, is this opportunity really worth it versus hanging on to my cash here? And it will make it the case that some of these things, increasingly, it just becomes no. When debt cost nearly nothing and cash was basically worthless, sure, send it out on any old thing. Grow in as many ways as you possibly can, as long as they'll generate at least some money for you. Nowadays, it feels like the move this year has made it quite a stark difference to stuff. Things have to be much, much, much better investments to justify getting bought these days.
Yeah, and this is the thing as well, isn't it? I think I always see recessions as an opportunity for the government to provide actual proper stimulus in areas where, where they can get a decent return from it, getting people who have now been kicked, have lost jobs into jobs, into infrastructure jobs, or creating infrastructure. This is the time to really build things to sort of like try and help the economy out a little bit. So one of the reasons, one of the things I have seen is that they're basically trying to lessen the CET1 liquidity ratios for insurers, and they're hoping that will mean that the insurers will have a little bit of extra money in their float that they will then be able to maybe fund some private investments here and there, and not have to hold as much money back in case of any kind of shock. I don't think that's going to happen, because I think the insurers are just going to look at the Bank of England base rate and say, well, I can get 3% on my money if I just stash it with you. Well, I don't really see the need to take any risks on any kind of private infrastructure bill, and that's not our forte. I just think that's just going to end up with the insurers, which is a good thing if you hold a British insurer. And I think it's just going to end up with these guys making a little bit more money off the government here. So I am not convinced by that. I guess the other thing we should mention, Steve, because I forgot to mention it back when we were talking about Chase, is that the actual premium bond rate has improved as well. So that's gone from what I believe was 2.2 to 3%, and they have basically 3 times some of the bigger prizes. So if you get so I think it's 25k, 50k, and 100k off the top of my head. The odds on winning that prize now are trebled, so that brings the overall rate to about 3%. So that was interesting enough for me. I shuffled half of my emergency fund into premium bonds.
Ooh.
So I'm quite interested. So I've got half of it in the Santander 2.72% bond account, and I've got half of it in premium bonds. So if I'm not here next week, I've won $1 million.
Well done. I was going to say, do you have anything in premium bonds? I sold all mine at roughly the start of the year and bunged it all into realty income, which I'm actually reasonably pleased about. It's going quite well.